So I think that at this point, it really is hard to imagine a rapid reintegration of Russia into the global economy and having much leverage over these developments within the Russian elite at all, unfortunately.
Yeah, I have to admit, I felt a little uncomfortable here with two conservatives. Somehow or another, I became the warmonger, but. Welcome to The Optimistic American. Today, we have a lively discussion on Israel and Ukraine and how that has an effect on the United States and the role that we're playing in the world. Now, we have two great guests. First, we have on Governor Doug Ducey. Now, Doug is running an organization called the Citizens for a Free Enterprise, and we utilize that to talk about what's the reason? Why are we involved in these two conflicts? And why is this even important to us? We also have on our show Professor Henry Thompson. Henry is a professor at ASU. He focuses on global studies, democratization, as well as international political economy. He is a fascinating professor, very popular at ASU with his classes. But more importantly, he really can give us a great view of authoritarians and how they're thinking. This is a good show. You're going to enjoy it. It's one where we're focused on geopolitical issues, and it's part of our new series where we're bringing together different political experts to talk about current events. Now, if you like what we're doing, push that subscribe button. Or if you want, go online to www.optamerican.com/premium. Become one of our members. But either way, always leave us a comment. If you like what we're doing or don't like what we're doing, we want to hear it. We actually read those comments, and they have a big effect on what it is that we're trying to do in the future. Thanks so much for being a part of the Optimistic American. Now we're on with our show today. Well, I'd like to welcome all of you to the Optimistic American show today, and I want to start with our new guest, who we're hoping is going to be a regular, Professor Henry Thompson. Henry, thanks for coming on. I know that you're an associate professor at ASU, both in political and global studies, but the bigger issue that's going on with you in your life is you just had a newborn baby. Tell us about that.
You did. Thank you, Paul. On Saturday, our second son, Arthur, arrived, and he's healthy, and his mother is doing great. And so we're just feeling very lucky and slightly exhausted at this point, although he's sleeping a lot better than his older brother did at the same time. So we're doing A-okay.
Yeah, that's a lot of work. So we're going to talk about Israel and Ukraine, but before we get to the darker side, I just had a 2-year-old baby a couple of years ago. I have a 2-year-old today, and I have a friend who has kind of a very dark sense of humor. When I had the baby, he said, okay, let me give you some advice. You haven't had children in a long time. He said, one of the things that you need to do is make certain that you breastfeed. So I said, yeah, I guess they've done a lot of studies on how nutritious that is and how important it is. And he said, no. He said, that way at 2 o'clock in the morning, the only person who can feed the baby is your wife, and you won't have to get up. So I didn't say anything. I see him about, I don't know, a month later, and he goes, how's that going? So I said, well, actually, my wife's milk dried up, so that wasn't such a good plan. He said, let me tell you what you do. He said, tonight, go in. He said, and when the baby wants to be fed, take the bottle in, put it in the microwave, make it as hot as you can. Go back in the bedroom, pull on the baby's feet, tell your wife, hey, there's something wrong with the baby. And when she comes in, just squirt some of that hot milk on her arm. You'll never have to do it again. So in any event, we'll probably have
These are dirty tricks.
We'll probably have to cut this out of this particular show. We'll see. But
I was going to say, Paul, you realize we are recording, don't you?
Governor, you have a couple of children. Any advice for new parents?
Well, listen, I think you know what you're doing, but Henry, I'd say congratulations on Arthur and just enjoy it. You're in complete control right now. It doesn't last very long. I'm lucky. I have 3 boys, 26, 24, and 20. We're pretty much empty nesters. So they say that the days are long, but the years are short. And I think that's very
Congratulations to you, too.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Paul. I don't always see evidence of that in my household, but I do hear it from trusted
Yeah,
others.
I promise you,
I'm
from
sure
what
it's
I've
true.
seen, you're in good shape. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to start with a conversation about what is going on in Israel and Ukraine. And, you know, obviously the what's happened in Israel is having an impact on our thoughts about what's taking place in Ukraine itself. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to really start with a question and have an understanding of how everyone on the panel sees what really is the role of the United States. Now, let me tell you why I want to start with that. You know, at the end of World War II, the infrastructure of almost every country had been destroyed by World War II, with the notable exception of the United States. The United States not only stepped up and played a role in the Marshall Plan, which most people know about, us giving money to Japan and to Germany to rebuild them, but we actually helped rebuild most of the rest of the world. We gave them access to our financial system. We gave them access to debt. We also let them sell product into the United States, which, by the way, that was at no small cost to American labor over time. But the key was there was a quid pro quo. The answer was we knew that the Soviet Union was both a communistic system and as well as an authoritarian government, and Western democracy was threatened by it. So the quid pro quo was you had to pick a side. Well, we have neo-isolationist movements that are happening in the United States. A lot of people think about the America First movement. I can promise you there are groups on the left that are every bit as much of an isolationist as there are groups on the right. They exist politically on both sides, but they're questioning what is our role? What role should we be playing? So I'd like to start with that question. And Henry, maybe I'll start with you. If you could tell me what you think our role should be, specifically as it relates to eventually, why are we in Iraq and Israel? And should we even be there?
Right, yeah, no, I totally agree with the sort of starting point that you take, Paul, this post-war moment. It really shaped the post-war world all the way through the present day, at least in our half of the world, right? In the non-communist world, only after 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union did we see Eastern Europe and Russia and Central Asia and things entering into this Western-led or US-led system of globalization. So that's now in some ways moving into the past, and there are different views about how the United States should manage this transition, right? And that's kind of the big, great debate that's going on in the United States at the moment, is how I would characterize a lot of what's going on in domestic politics in the United States. Is it's a form of great debate about Americans' place in the world. Should the United States be open to imports from places like China if it's going to have an impact on manufacturing jobs in places like Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, et cetera, et cetera? Should the United States be involved in foreign conflicts in places like Afghanistan and Iraq if it's going to involve, you know, sort of open-ended commitments that may involve a lot of financial resources and potentially even deaths? And that big, great debate is, I think, one of the major polarizing factors in the country at the moment. And so it's not really clear where the American public is going to come down on this at this point. I think a lot of Americans are probably unsure. I think that it's tempting to look at the post-war moment and say we need to sort of recommit to those same institutions like the World Trade Organization, the IMF, this big commitment to Europe in form of NATO and things. But I'm also realistic about whether the American public really has an appetite for that at this point. I think the challenge at the moment is for leaders in the United States to make the case that America shaping the international system, which personally I think is absolutely imperative, that America has a profound influence on shaping the trajectory of global commerce and international security. But politicians have to make the case that that's in the interest of Americans, rather than some sort of commitment to a liberal international order or some other abstract outcome, right? I think the case has to be made to Americans that this is in their own self-interest. And that's where I think the rubber really hits the road, and we're seeing a huge amount of disagreement about whether it really is or can be in America's interest to lead in that way.
Governor, any thoughts?
Well, I see America as the leader of the free world. I think that there's a lot of definition that needs to be filled in beyond that. And I would say in many ways, we've all grown up in a magical American moment. where we really have had one bad day as a country, speaking generally, and that was September 11th. So much of how the world has been organized has been post World War II, with America coming out of that as a superpower. And Paul, you described the Cold War, the kind of the battle between freedom and collective societies, and that organized so much of our thinking. And post World War II, whether it was the formation of the United Nations, Bretton Woods, with America as the lender of last resort, NATO, the Marshall Plan, all of that has really allowed us to live in relative peace and prosperity, and to see that happen in so many other places around the globe. With the Berlin Wall coming down in 1989, and trusted social scientists like Fukuyama saying, this is the end of history, and freedom and democracy and free enterprise have won and will spread all over the world. And we saw some of that, at least beginnings, in places like China. And I think it's only rather recently that we've had a real sobering up in what we've seen in terms of what China is doing with our intellectual property, the fact that they're not liberalizing, they're becoming more authoritarian. Of course, we see Putin on the move in Eastern Europe, and October 7th in Israel. So this isn't the first time we've had an isolationist moment as a country. It's not the first time America First has been invoked. And I also think that can be misunderstood. We have a lot of friends and allies, and I think that's a good thing. I think we should have friends and allies. But I think it's also incumbent on the commander-in-chief to think about American interests first, and to be the lead spokesperson in making the case on where we will and will not be engaged, and also make sure we're holding our friends to account to their role in these endeavors to keep freedom and prosperity and relative peace, and in as many places around the globe as we can.
Yeah, I think both of you make great points. And, Henry, you begged the question, we have to explain to the public why this matters. I do think that it's important to think about what the world would look like if it weren't an American world order. And it is today. I mean, the idea of the rule of law being an international order is something that was established by the United States, which gave us the WPO and NATO, and as well as the United Nations, all of which oftentimes can be frustrating and irritating, but we end up playing a role in that as well, trying to keep the world moving through a set of rules where we agree to it, that there's not really a hierarchy. I think the difference is, if this change happens, the change is probably going to happen with China. I think China has huge problems in front of it, and I do not think it is assured at all that they're going to bypass the United States. But if China were to become, if the world order were to reverse itself, if the United States pulled back, if we became isolationist and China took over, there would be significant impacts. First, China doesn't see it, from the way I hear Xi talking, as this being about a rule of law type of order. Instead, it's a hierarchy with China at the top. And with China at the top, I think that how you see that they treat oftentimes other people, even in their own country, they're going to look for an order that begins to reverse itself and puts them into a position of being able to make decisions. And that's going to have an effect on Americans. First, if we lose the world's reserve currency, that would have an incredible effect on our ability to raise debt, the ability for us to be able to do many of the things that we do, and be able to have the ability to defend ourselves through oftentimes borrowed money. The second thing is, it starts to have an effect on supply lines, supply chains. American businesses would have to be subordinate at the end of the day to Chinese businesses. I think there's a whole set of reasons why this world order, staying the way that it is, has a dramatic impact on the quality of life on Americans and people who live in Western liberal societies. Now, the real question, though, that I would ask, George Orwell was the one who framed this concept of a Cold War. It basically was a war without violence, or a war without guns. We won that Cold War. Now, we won it because I think there are two ways that you would identify a victory. The first one is the Soviet Union went away, but more importantly, we avoided a nuclear conflict. And I think that second part is an important part of that victory. It would have dramatically changed who we are without that happening. Today, I think we're in a new Cold War. And the new Cold War is kind of with this axis of authoritarians, including China, Russia, and Iran, who I think want to disrupt that world order. In fact, I don't think so. They say so. They seem to be very clear about that. So my question that goes back to both of you is, do you think we're in a new Cold War, or is that an overestimation of where we are?
Well, I think that the Cold War was in some ways similar to what we are witnessing here, in that we just witnessed about 20, 30 years of what you could call a unipolar moment, right? Where the United States was the preponderant power in the entire international system. The Soviet Union had collapsed. That was the United States' main competitor. The European Union emerged during that time, but it's not really a nation state. It doesn't have military forces. It doesn't have the leadership role that the Soviet Union had. And China, through the 90s and early 2000s, just wasn't a global leadership sort of nation state in the way that it's become. So as we've moved out of that period of American dominance into sort of a multipolar world, you can say that there's this confrontation between the United States and perhaps China, or maybe even, as you sort of described it, China and these set of allies, most importantly, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. But at the same time, there are important differences, right? So first of all, the Cold War was structured around this conflict of ideologies that we don't have as coherently today, right? There is this communist system in China with sort of form of state-led capitalism with a totalitarian Chinese Communist Party at the top of it. But the other members of China's alliance, or their sort of main partners, Iran and Russia, don't have that ideology anymore. So it's not this totalitarian system, this bloc that we were arranged against in the Cold War. There are important divisions among these states that we didn't have between the Soviets and the Eastern European countries, for example. And those differences, even between the Soviets and the Chinese, after they started to emerge in the 50s and 60s, they were still communist countries, right? So Cold War, communism versus capitalist democracies, we don't have that clear division anymore. The other big difference, I would say, to the first Cold War is that we trade with all these countries, especially China. There's very little international commerce going on between Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and Western Europe and the United States, or between China, at least until the 80s or 90s, and the United States and Western Europe. Today, the trade flows between the United States and China are tremendous. They're the biggest in terms of volume in the world, I believe. And even the trade flows with Russia until the invasion of Ukraine were significant because of gas and oil flows, right? So the interdependence between the two blocs that was so low during the Cold War is much, much greater. So I think that there is this growing antagonism, this growing conflict between this Chinese-led group of states and the United States and its Western allies. But at the same time, there are important differences and maybe even cleavages that we can see that weren't there during the Cold War, right? There could potentially be opportunities for engaging with this bloc of states that weren't there during the Cold War, through commerce and through appealing to the interests of different states within this group that you couldn't do when they were all a monolithic communist kind of grouping.
Governor?
I don't think we're in a Cold War. That's not how I would describe it. At the same time, I don't think we're certainly not in a hot war. I think we're posturing, we're positioning. Unfortunately, I believe we've projected weakness with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I think there are great power rivalries out there. And without a doubt, China would be the number one rival and is among our largest trading partners. So, Paul, you mentioned the reserve currency. It's something that I don't think is understood well enough by the American public. I've always thought it was a real secret weapon for the United States and part of our soft power, and important that we maintain and continue to be the world's reserve currency. It gives us tremendous power. And then I without becoming a harsh partisan, I do think that this administration's energy policy has hurt us tremendously around the globe. It wasn't that long ago that we were selling energy to our friends. Today, we're buying it from our enemies. And this is much of the pipeline that you see with Russia and the funding of Putin's pursuits in Eastern Europe. So I think we should be producing energy in this country, putting us in a position where we can be the decision maker and also help our friends out and be more selective. And the last thing I would say on this is that we don't have American boots on the ground here, and I don't think there's an appetite for American boots to be on the ground. So this engagement, I know that Xi is in San Francisco right now, and that President Biden is going to be having his first conversation with him in more than a year. I don't know what you would call this, a Monroe Doctrine 2.0. I think COVID gives us the opportunity to reassess our supply chains, to see what can be reshored and repatriated. I always wanted to see everything come to the state of Arizona, and not the state of Arizona, then one of the other 49 states. If not one of the 49 states, then Mexico or Canada, which are our largest trading partners. If not those two, I think we should be working more closely with Central America and South America. I think a peaceful, prosperous hemisphere is part of the answer when we have spirits on the move. And you identified exactly what I see. And I think anyone who's clear-eyed in China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea as real concerns geopolitically.
Thanks, Governor. So I do see it as a Cold War, but I think even if you don't, the things that we utilize to solve the last Cold War will be the same things that will help us be successful in this, whatever we call it. To start with this, it has to be, you have to show strength over weakness. If you're not showing strength, there's no doubt in my mind, both Russia or China, I think, are more than willing to continue to push us back. The second thing that I think is important is you cannot have a direct conflict. Direct conflicts with nuclear powers is highly problematic. You have to be willing to stand back from that. The third issue is you need allies. You need people who are on your side. And it's not lost on me. We have strong allies in NATO. We have strong allies in Japan, New Zealand, Australia. There are parts of the world where Western liberal democracy binds us together. And candidly, we're a bigger threat to the authoritarians, and they're a bigger threat to us in that process. And I also think we're the buyers. I mean, almost all those countries I just mentioned, we're the ones who are buying product for the most part. China's the one that's selling it. And oftentimes through the selling it, it begins to have an effect on the labor forces inside each one of those communities. And that in itself creates a pressure. I think that you're going to see pushback on those fronts that are going to be taking place. But to me, the single biggest key is understanding that, you spoke about the world's reserve currency. All that really is if you have currency that's out in the marketplace and you have excess capital, what kind of currency are you going to store it in? Are you going to store it in the yuan? Are you going to store it in the dollar? Are you going to store it in the pound? Well, the American currency today, I think, is at about a little over 40% of all the storage of capital in the world is stored in the American dollar. I believe the yuan is like 2 or 3%. I'm not really worried about them replacing us today. I mean, they manipulate their currency all the time to try to increase their exports. Who wants to store their money in a currency that that they're going to on purpose devalue? I mean, that in itself doesn't make sense. But I do think that we have to think about our role, and that brings us to a way to pivot to our next subject, which is Ukraine. Henry, here's my first question on Ukraine. Do you even think that this is winnable at this point?
I think that one of the problems with the Ukraine conflict has been the definition of victory has been unclear for a very long time. And it's not entirely clear whether the United States government really stands behind the Ukrainians' maximalist goals, right, of retaking all of Ukrainian territory from pre-2014 borders, right, including the Crimea and these Russian-occupied areas in the east and the Donbass, etc., or whether the United States essentially thinks that some sort of a negotiated settlement is going to have to be reached where some of these territories are either permanently occupied by Russia illegally under international law, or whether they are able to be formally made part of Russia. And so I think that the definition of victory is unclear at this point, and the strategic situation is difficult. The Ukraine is a much smaller country than Russia. The population is smaller. The military production capacity is smaller. The capacity of Western Europe to support Ukraine has been shown to be embarrassingly small, right? We thought that the Europeans were going to be able to supply a lot more armaments to the Ukraine than they have been able to in the end. And the Russians, on the other hand, have been able to rally support from places, unexpected places, Iran, North Korea. North Korea has been providing tremendous amounts of artillery munitions to Russia in ways that we didn't anticipate. And so essentially, I think that the definition of victory, as it's been laid out by the Ukrainian government, by Zelensky, is probably unattainable at this point, at least given the way that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has gone this summer. What that means, I don't know. Whether that means that the Ukraine is going to turn into one of these frozen conflicts, like in other parts of the former Soviet Union, like between Armenia and Azerbaijan, for example. We just have had some sort of recent flare-up of conflict there. It's been going on for years, or whether this might be a sort of a hot war that goes on for a very long time, but at a low level. I don't know, but at this point, the definition of victory, I think, has to be critically reassessed in order for any sort of victory to be really contemplated after the failure of the counteroffensive this summer.
Yeah, I agree with you on this. You have to define victory, right? And today, the way that Ukraine is defining victory seems to be that they need back all the 2014 territories. They need war reparations from Russia for what they did wrong. And you also need a war tribunal to try them for crimes. Well, I think the only way that you are able to be successful as that is you got to get both St. Petersburg and Moscow. I mean, you can't just stop at the border, because they're never going to go along with that. I understand that that's what the Ukrainians want, but it seems to me that a bigger victory for Ukraine would be to either become part of NATO or get a security guarantee, or to become a part of the European Union. And maybe we have some border discussion that can take place. Now, I don't know that Putin is at all ready for a real discussion, but I think that from the United States' interest, there's a reason to do that. This war, they clearly, the Ukrainians had success in the beginning, and the Russians faltered big time, and they were able to push this line back to the Dnieper River, which I think was significant. The problem's been crossing that river. Now at Kherson, they found some success in the last couple of weeks. I think we should point that out. They were able to get over Kherson Oblast onto the other side. They have a small garrison of people that are there, and maybe that becomes a beachhead that they can expand out. They've also seen some successes with being able to dramatically impact the Russian Navy, sinking dry ports, having an effect on one of their major ships as well as a submarine. But there is a question about whether or not we're at this war of attrition standpoint, where this is just going to become a slugfest that lasts for a very, very long time and takes a lot of money from Americans to be successful. Governor, any thoughts on this?
World War II ended with unconditional surrender. I was just in New York City and was able to go by and see U.S. Grant's memorial in the northern part of Manhattan, in the Harlem area. I don't know if you've ever seen that. There's some great books in there. I was able to grab a couple. His troops said that U.S. stood for unconditional surrender in the way he handled the battles during the Civil War. It's been a long time since we've had that kind of clarity in victory and defeat. We've suffered through things like Vietnam, and then the Cold War, which we did win, and we say without a shot being fired. But this is a real opportunity for the president to define what success looks like. And this has become much more complicated since October 7th and what's happening in Israel with Hamas. So this is really a time for real leadership out of the Oval Office and the Situation Room. for us to set our priorities, to define who our friends are, but to also work collaboratively with our allies to defend and promote America's best interest. This is a tough one. We know that Ukraine is on the side of freedom and a rules-based order, and that Vladimir Putin did invade. But I also think it's time for attention to what's happening here, especially when there's competing interest in Israel and Afghanistan on what's going to happen with this
Yeah, I
Congress.
think, and Governor, I'm interested in your thought on this. I think there's always a difference between America's position and even our closest allies' position. It's reasonable that countries can come from a different place. It's not lost on me that I think Russia, in many ways, has already lost. Right? They had a humiliating setback by not getting Kiev in the first 2 weeks. They had their tanks ending up in a position where they outran their actual gas lines. They had to abandon their tanks because they didn't have enough food for their troops. They suffered a series of defeats that went back. They've seen, they're considered to be a four-ocean navy. They have a navy that is in the Arctic. They have one in the Baltic, one in the Black Sea, and one in the Pacific. Well, those navies are important to them to be able to transport products. And in many ways, they've been severely damaged by this war, not only by the sinking of the dry dock, but if you go up to Sweden and Finland, going into the Black Sea, they're in this position where they used to have those countries being neutral, but now they've come into NATO. I guess Sweden is going to come into NATO, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. But that means they've lost all of that shoreline. From the United States standpoint, if we were trying to cripple Russia, they did a much better job doing it than we could have ever done, having tried to plan it. And I guess my question to you, even though I think we should support Ukraine, and I do think there's a reason for us to stay there, would you agree with me that in many respects we've already had a pretty big victory on this?
Well, I don't know that the United States has had a big victory here. I think that Russia has had a defeat in many ways. I don't see Russia as that great a threat. I see them as a threat and a predator, but they have an economy, I think, about the size of Wisconsin and Minnesota combined. We've seen their military, and they are not having any success in surprising and conquering their neighbor. Yet at the same time, they project and wreak havoc on the world stage, and seem to be communicating with Iran, seem to be communicating with Syria, seem to be putting Israel in a compromised position by being positioned just north of their border. I also, my mindset has always been that politics should end at the water's edge.
Hear, hear.
So I don't think anybody should bet against America, and I still think we're in a terrific position. But so much of what we don't have has been exposed here. I mean, let's face it. In the last generation, our country hasn't gone to war. Our men and women in uniform have gone to war. And when we hear about these munition supplies that are depleted and are being sent to Ukraine, and we know what may be needed in Israel, not even to speak of what we need here, the nation is not mobilized for this. And it doesn't seem to me that we're serious about our defense budget, about our investment in our nuclear triad and the United States Navy, which I think sometimes people look at the four branches as co-equal, like they do the branches of government. But it has been our Navy that has allowed for peaceful trade around the world since World War II. And we're at a low point for ships on the water, with China on the move, with Belt and Road and investment in other countries and taking advantage of their financial position. So all of these things make the geopolitical side of the equation incredibly complicated, important for us to be engaged where appropriate. But I would say, Paul, in my lifetime, I've never seen such a serious geopolitical situation with such unserious politics out of Washington, D.C. And to me, that's highly concerning.
Yeah, I think you're right on the supply chain.
I don't mind me interjecting.
Go ahead, Henry.
Yeah, I also would in part agree with the governor. Um, I'm not entirely clear on why a collapse of the Russian economy it was if we wound the clock back before, the invasion of Ukraine. I'm not sure why a collapse of the Russian economy or a decimation of its military forces was really in the United States' strategic interest, right? The main strategic competitor of the United States is China. It would have been better if Russia had been deterred from invading the Ukraine. I think it would have been in the United States' interest to not have this conflict occur. It would have also been in the interest of Ukraine to not have this destruction of its cities and its manpower and its this awful conflict happening within its borders. And so, I do understand the point that the Russians have really gotten a bloody nose from this conflict, but I still think it would have been better if it could have been avoided and Russia could have maintained its semi-pariah, but still somewhat standing within the international community, that it was trading with the West, that at least there were some links there to have some leverage over Russia. Now Russia has been forced into the arms of Iran and China and even North Korea in a way that I think is incredibly dangerous. And that's what worries me about the broader strategic consequences of the Ukrainian conflict, is that you have this real sort of antagonistic relationship with Russia that's forced it into a stronger alliance with powers that are really aligned against the United States in a way that was not quite as pronounced before this Ukraine conflict.
All right, Henry, you're an expert on authoritarian governments moving to democracy. You actually teach a class, I believe, on that subject. So let me try to frame this question for you, and maybe it can help flush this idea out, because I think this is an important idea. I start with the following belief that Russia does have an ideology. The ideology that they have is anti-Westernism. All right, this whole idea of the golden billion, that's really an ideologically based system that says that there's an oppressor, the United States and Western Europe, and that they're harming the rest of the world. And it's their way of doing the same thing that Marxism did, right? Creating an oppressed and an oppressor group. I believe in Putin's mindset, the ability for him to really ever move in our direction was very low. That he had more of a mindset that inevitably wanted to upset the American world order. Now, first, you may not agree with that. I'd love to know if you don't agree with that, if you thought that there actually was an opportunity for him to move in the United States direction. Because at the end of the day, in an authoritarian government, one person ends up making the decision. It's not like what's going on in their society or public opinion polls or even in their government that all of that matters. What matters is where is that one individual going. Now, that's my view, but I'm open to hearing where that may be wrong or maybe where you see it differently.
Well, I think when we talk about a sort of a Russian mindset, I think that it's kind of have to separate that from whatever's going on in Vladimir Putin's head, right? I've been to St. Petersburg as a tourist, and one thing that really struck me was how Western-oriented the city was, how Peter the Great looked to Western Europe, to the Renaissance, to Germany, etc., to get all of his intellectual influences, and that was really where he wanted Russia to go. And so when we talk about Russian history, it's not always the case that they've been antagonistic to the West to the degree that they are at the moment. And I think you could even say that there's been a transition in Putin's thinking as well. It's obviously extremely difficult to know what these sort of authoritarian leaders are really thinking at any point in time. They're always obfuscating, they're always guarding themselves against threats from other members of their ruling elite, and also from the broader population, to the extent that the broader population is even really involved in politics in Russia. But I do think that at the present point that Russia and Putin in particular is incredibly oriented against the West, and that's part of how he's rallying his fellow elites around him, right, is with this very nationalistic, very anti-Western rhetoric. He is privileging the military and the security services against all the other branches of government as a way of protecting himself against threats, as a way of staying in power. Now, of course, authoritarian regimes, they also need money, right? And one of the main sources of revenue for Russia was always the oil and gas industry, and that was the most modern and the most globalized part of the Russian economy. And it also generated a lot of the money that kept the Russian elite in power. It bought off the powerful people within that regime. And so I think that the disruption of the gas deliveries to Western Europe, the restrictions on Russian gas exports are going to destabilize that regime in unexpected ways. And this is another way where we see, okay, they can't export these resources, very valuable resources to the West, so they're turning to China and India, North Korea, other places to get the resources to keep the regime going. And so as this sort of building on what I said before, right, that there's sort of endogenous development where the Ukraine war has put a whole process of events in train that have led to a growing isolation of Russia from the West that's going to be very, very difficult to reverse, I think. And even the resource flows within the regime that are so important for maintaining Putin in power are becoming more and more disrupted in relation to the West and making the regime less and less dependent on the West and less interested in cooperation. So I think that at this point, it really is hard to imagine a rapid reintegration of Russia into the global economy and having much leverage over these developments within the Russian elite at all, unfortunately.
Yeah, I have to admit, I felt a little uncomfortable here with two conservatives. Somehow or another, I became the warmonger. But in any event, okay, so I do think there's a question about where the world is going, and I love Peter Zion's new book. I don't know if any of you have read his book, but he does a great job of talking about how globalism is over and we're moving towards regionalism. Now, I'm a supporter of globalism. I think it's done more to promote human progress than almost anything that we've ever seen in human history. But that was mainly because of Western, liberal, democratic, capitalistic ideas that were being implemented. In fact, I think China, if you look at China during Mao's period of time, they were only growing at about a 2.5% on an annual basis. After they began to implement more capitalistic reforms, they saw an 8 to 9% increase. It's had a dramatic impact. Now, of course, they also began to trade with us because we cut a deal with them with Henry Kissinger to try to flip the tables on the Soviet Union. But nonetheless, they gained a tremendous amount from this system, and it seems to me odd now that they want to try to overthrow it. Here's what I want to do, though. I want to pivot to this question. I want to pivot to Israel. And the question that I have with Israel is probably as problematic or at least challenging for the United States as is Ukraine, in that Russia and China are doing their very best to level the rest of the world against us because of what's happening in Israel. Now, I'm a huge supporter of Israel. I think they were wronged in this one. I think it was overwhelming. But in saying that, we have to recognize there still is an impact that's going to happen to them and that's going to happen to us through their having to go into Gaza to try to flush out the tunnels and to flush out the other things that are going to happen. The question I have is proportionality. There's a lot of discussion today about, is Israel having a proportional response? And for me, I think back to Japan, and Japan bombed the United States in a sneak attack, obviously in Pearl Harbor. Before that date, we had a dispute. And you could look back on that dispute. You could see areas where the United States was wrong and areas where Japan was wrong. We were both jockeying for position. But after that date, because of that sneak attack, it became a war. And there no longer was any, in our mind, there was no give and take. There was no possibility of anything else other than victory and survival. I can't imagine what the United States would have been like if they would have, instead of bombing our sailors and our Navy, if they would have gone in and murdered toddlers like what we saw from Hamas. I mean, I can't even imagine what our response would have been to that. To me, once you enter into a war phase, proportionality goes away. Now, we're complaining a lot about Russia on that and Ukraine, and certainly I feel despair over it. But I'm not quite sure that once you get to that stage that you can really expect a government to be proportional when their goal is to root out an enemy that's as dangerous as Hamas. And so, Professor, I'm going to start with you. If you could maybe give me kind of your thought on that.
Well, I think that Paul, you're probably right. I think that the Israeli government is going to use the military forces at its disposal to root out Hamas in Gaza, and it's very likely to be a relatively prolonged and very bloody battle. You know, you don't have to have engaged very deeply with any of the historical examples of urban conflict, whether it was in Stalingrad or even in Berlin in 1945 or in Mosul or any of these places, to know that this is a very, very dangerous situation for the Israeli armed forces. It's very emotionally charged. There's a lot of antagonism against the Hamas terrorists there in Gaza, and unfortunately, it's also incredibly densely populated, and there are a lot of civilians there in the Gaza Strip. It's a incredibly difficult, it's a tragic situation, really, for all concerned. But the actions of the Israeli government, I think, they are going to happen. I don't think that anyone can really stop that from occurring at this point, but they're really driving a wedge through Western societies and among Western governments. You know, you had 300,000 people protesting in solidarity or supporting the Palestinian cause in London, I believe, on the weekend. In Germany, they've had to ban pro-Palestinian protests because of their history of the Holocaust. They don't feel it's appropriate to allow pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protests in Germany, and that's caused a huge amount of consternation in Germany. And this is going on all over the world. So this is another front where these foreign events are really posing a massive problem for the Biden administration, for the American government, and it's going to be extremely difficult for the Americans to really walk this line where they stand behind their very strong ally, Israel, but maintain their relationships with governments in not only in the Middle East, where I think it's going to be extremely difficult, but even in Western Europe and in other parts of the world as well. I think this is a really, really difficult problem for the Biden administration. And when he meets with Xi today in San Francisco, I think that he, as Governor Ducey kind of suggested, he comes at this from a relatively weak position. He can't afford a problem with China at this point, given the problems in Ukraine and Israel being so intractable and so fraught. He cannot afford any sort of flare up in the South China Sea, any sort of diplomatic problems with China like this balloon that floated over the country, things like this. He's really coming to this meeting with Xi from a relatively weak position.
Governor?
100% support for Israel in this conflict. Proportionality is not the word of the day right now. Israel sees this as existential to their survival. Hamas has been clear into what their objective is. And I don't know if you saw the Sunday shows with Bibi on, I think all three or four of them, but he was very clear in that they are going to press their objectives regardless of how anyone else feels. Now, I do think on many fronts, the Biden administration has done the right thing by Israel to date. And at the same time, there's been Tony Blinken's tweet the day after the attack calling for ceasefire. That tweet was immediately deleted. So I do wonder what is in the mind of this administration. But I think Netanyahu, who is shoulder to shoulder right now with Benny Gantz, his chief rival in that government, on defending Israel. And the other thing that I think is top of mind is the one thing the Israeli government promises its citizens is security. And that has been shattered. So if you think back to Pearl Harbor and December 6th, 1941 in America, we were in a very isolationist mood. And December 7th happened. The USS Arizona is still at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. There's a ceremony for the Arizona governor every year, and participation with all four branches of the military. Several days later, FDR declared war. It's the last time we've declared war as a nation. Germany declared war against us, I believe that day or the day after. And everything since has transpired. So you don't know what the future holds here. And right now, this is between Israel and Hamas, and we see the other players that are projecting and doing this as a proxy, including Iran. I think we've demonstrated our alliance with Israel and that we are going to be supportive of them. But I think this is something that must be top of mind for the president, the Secretary of State, our military readiness, everything going forward. I think it's going to be even more difficult as we head into an election year. Now, we've done this before. The election of 1864 was more consequential at that time and is at the height of the Civil War. But I think there's a lot of unknowns right now. You mentioned Peter Zion's book. I really enjoyed it. And I like that he broke out of some of the paradigms that we've been raised with around globalization. And I didn't see him necessarily as anti-globalization, as just giving the realities of what America's leadership around the globe had provided to nations around the globe. And we're seeing authoritarians right now that just don't want that. They don't appreciate it. They don't want to participate in it. And they see us as a nation that needs to be put in its place. I think that our country and our people will be fine regardless. But I do love us in the role of being the promoters of peace and prosperity around the world. But we're seeing that there's some rivals out there that aren't so concerned about their people as they're concerned about their position in the world order. And that's where the real difference is. And I think that's one of the magical things about a representative republic is if the president is only thinking about himself and not about the citizens, well, he's going to find out very quickly that the citizens will make a change. That's not true in China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea.
Right. All right. So, Professor, here's my next question for you. And this was one ideally suited for you because it's really about what's going on our own university campuses. So, it's not lost on me. It seems to me amazing that I remember 4 years ago during the Charlottesville march where you had people with torches marching saying, Jews will not replace us. Right? I thought, this is a right-wing problem. I listened to what went on at Harvard University and to the professor who almost with glee talked about what happened to Israel. And it was, what the torch march, they weren't saying things nearly as bad as what the left was saying. That's stunning to me to listen to. Now, even this idea of apartheid to me is a state that is based upon racial tendencies, that all of the policies of the government are racially designed, and they divide up the population between black or white or whatever thing that you want to use. Now, why that's not fair to use with Israel, I've been to Israel multiple times, and in Israel, what I can tell you is there are many, many Muslims who live inside of Israel proper, and they have all the same rights as any other Israeli. They have political parties, they have people that end up being elected, they have civil rights, equal rights. So it must not be about race. Otherwise, they would be doing that inside of Israel proper. And in fact, if you look at the Middle East, this is the place that stands out for having rights for women and making certain that those Western liberal values that we value, that they're in place. And most of the other places throughout the Middle East, they're not. I'm kind of shocked with liberals when I listen to it, and I feel odd attacking liberals on this because, I used to be a Democrat. But the part that's difficult for me is if Hamas being successful does more to harm women's rights than almost anything else you could imagine. And yet, we're watching these things happen on college campuses. Now, my view of what's happening with the colleges is it's hard for them to escape responsibility for this. I'd love it if they said, hey, when the conservatives and Ann Coulter showed up, we gave them the right to speak. They were allowed to say whatever it was that they wanted to say. This group now can say the same thing. But the fact that they closed out the conservatives and now they allow this group to speak, seems to make it look like the universities are actually endorsing that position. This has to be a big problem on college campuses. I'd love to know if that's true, and I'd also love to know kind of what your thoughts are around that.
Yeah, that's a really complicated question and situation with, university politics. So, university politics have been becoming polarized for about, I would say, 10 years. When I was an undergraduate, things weren't as heated on college campuses. I also didn't go to an undergraduate campus in the United States. I had a very different experience, but things are becoming increasingly polarized on campus, and we're having this huge discussion about free speech and about what the correct place of debate and invited speakers and protests and things is on campus. And this Israel-Hamas conflict has really played into that in a very sort of unexpected way, because, as you said, a lot of the problems seem to be that there were right-wing demonstrations like we saw at Charlottesville that people objected to conservative speakers being invited to campus. We've seen a lot of examples of conservative speakers being, deplatformed, or there being protests against them and things on campus, etc. But now we see this left-wing protest movement that in support of Palestine against Israel that has taken on some pretty radical forms in some places, and some people are objecting to that as well. And I'm lucky enough to work at a university here at Arizona State, where the university, I think, is pretty even-handed about these sorts of things, and we have
number one fire rating.
Yes, exactly. Number one rating from this organization that ranks the universities for free speech. And so, although I'm sure there's not a completely even playing field, at the end of the day, we have conservative speakers that are conservative enough that are causing people to be outraged, and we also have liberal groups having protests and demonstrations that cause people to be outraged as well. That's maybe a sign of a healthy discourse in campus culture. But the sorts of perhaps borderline anti-Semitic, anti-Israel sentiments that we're seeing sort of being bandied around on campuses also disturb me. I studied in Germany. I lived in Germany for a long time. I've visited concentration camps, and any sort of anti-Semitic or racist rhetoric that I see really disturbs me, having learned so much about the history of the Holocaust and things like that. And so I understand where you're coming from. That it's disturbing. I think there has to be a robust and open debate, and people should be open to discussion. But that really did disturb me. Some of the more radical statements against Jewish students, against Israel. I was kind of shocked to see some of that come out at other campuses as well. And then, there's a broader discussion we could have. It's probably too extensive at this point about the ideological foundations of why people view the world in this way and see Israel as a settler colonial or apartheid state. But that's kind of a big can of worms that we maybe don't need to open up right now.
Yeah, unless we had another hour. So Governor, I'm going to flip this back over to you, but I want to say to Henry's comment, my own personal opinion is it's important if they have a Palestinian view or a view supporting Hamas. I support them speaking out. The only answer to that is that people who disagree with it have to speak out. And unfortunately, oftentimes people in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party that are neither a part of the torch-lit parade that happened at Charlottesville nor a part of what's happening on this far left today, they don't speak up. They feel uncomfortable speaking up. I think it's more important now than ever for other people to speak up and to give their point of view, which is part of why I asked this question. Governor Ducey, I know you've had some pretty strong opinions on this. I'd just love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think it's shocking to see what's happening on these college campuses. And as governor, I signed a Holocaust bill, and I signed an anti-Semitism definition. And I knew that these were issues, but I had no idea how deep this rot had crept in at the university level. I point to two things. Barry Weiss gave a recent speech at the Federalist Society. You can put it in the show notes. It's excellent. Everyone should watch it. And Peggy Noonan wrote about this in her declaration very soon after October 7th, saying this oppressed narrative, this anti-Western civilization and Western civilization as colonizer has crept in, and it's crept in at our most elite universities. I loved what former Senator Ben Sasse put out in his letter from the University of Florida with complete moral clarity and defense of Israel, and pointing out that Hamas are terrorists and that killing, raping, and beheading babies, women, and innocent people can never be justified or put into context. I am proud of what's happening at Arizona State University and U of A. By and large, I think we have a lot of civil discourse. I think it's one thing to talk about the Palestinian situation, which is dramatically different from what's happening with Hamas. So this may be a time, much like COVID was, in terms of a crisis where school choice found purchase with the public. Arizona was the first state in the country to have a universal educational school choice where you can send your kid anywhere you want and use your taxpayer dollars. I think this is a crisis where we have to look at what is being taught in our grade schools, high schools, and university around American history and civics. And I don't want to see it whitewashed. I think we have a very heroic history, warts and all. We have always been in search of a more perfect union. And while we've made missteps and we've hit plateaus, we've become a better country decade over decade. And yet we have young people all over this nation in some of the most credentialed and privileged institutions that have somehow been taught to hate this country and hate this economic system. And I'm betting it didn't happen at their kitchen table. I think there's real reform that needs to be addressed. But first things first here. And then this is not even to point out the people that are tearing down these posters of people that were kidnapped and are still kidnapped and being held hostage in Gaza today. It's completely befuddling to me why anyone would think that is the proper thing to do. So I think there's a lot of work to do. I think this rot has crept in much more deeply than we could have ever imagined. And you pointed out the narrative from Charlottesville. This is on display not only all over our country on college campuses, but in large cosmopolitan, metropolitan cities around the world. Some of these marches have been shocking in their size and participation. I think we saw a couple 100,000, several 100,000 people show up in Washington, D.C. yesterday in support of Israel. I think we need to stand behind Israel. We need to stand behind people of Jewish faith and dissent. There's 15, I'm generalizing here, but I'm much closer to right than wrong. There's 15 million Jewish individuals in the entire world. 7 million plus in Israel, and they are under attack and assault. And this is something we thought we would never see again, and it's happening right now.
Yeah, we're just coming back from pre-Holocaust numbers, and when you think about that, the reason Israel ended up existing is because they were being persecuted all over the world, not just Germany. My in-laws came from Iraq. They were Jewish in Iraq, and they were persecuted by Saddam Hussein. And had it not been for Israel, their family would not have survived. They played a massive role in it. All right, Governor, this is going to be our last question. I'm going to ask it to both of you, but I want to start with you because you're doing some wonderful work with the Citizens for Free Enterprise. I'm going to take us all the way back to the very first question. Why? How do we win this? Let's assume I call it a Cold War. You say that it's not, but we both kind of agree that it's an issue. The question is, how are we going to be successful? And it seems to me the single most important thing that happened in the last Cold War that has to happen now is we have to win in technology. And the only way that I think that we win in technology is through making certain that our universities are funded, making certain that we have the infrastructure that we need, but most importantly, that people have the ability to own what it is that they create, that there are protections for the free enterprise, that we don't over-regulate them. I'd love to have your thoughts on that subject, and maybe tell us a little bit about, every time I get a chance, I'm going to plug your group. I'd like you to tell them how to get in contact with it as well.
Well, thank you, Paul. You call the podcast The Optimistic American. I would describe myself as the hopeful American because that puts something on me besides a rosy outlook. It's that human agency. And I think the ideas of freedom and free enterprise, we know what they've done for our country and our people and lifting people out of poverty around the world. And I'm heartened that there are no lost causes because there are no gained causes. This is always the battle here between freedom and tyranny and being from the people up to the centralized powers on down. And I think we're at a moment in our lifetime and around the world where these have again come into conflict. Citizens for Free Enterprise was set up to educate and advocate for these issues with young people, with people that are not as engaged civically, to also show the magic of our system and the value of it. We talk a lot about religious freedom and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, all important freedoms and all underpinned by economic freedom. That's what allows us to talk as Americans about our involvement around the world and where we can and cannot project power is the fact that we have this dynamic system that's created the greatest economy in the history of the world, and it's something that needs to be protected and advanced. It should concern everyone listening that if you held up a placard in a college classroom that said socialism and capitalism, it would be about a 50-50 proposition. 7 out of 10 millennials, according to Gallup, want to someday vote for a socialist. Now, if you dig deeper into the crosstab, 6% of those kids think socialism is actually training on social manners and social skills. They'll be very surprised if they ever attend a socialist rally. But we do have an opportunity here that when you term it as free enterprise versus big government socialism, we begin to win more hearts and minds. But this is something we need to continue to communicate on. Now we've got the attention of the country because of what's happening around the world, and we're heading into an election cycle. So there's much of the beauty and magic of our system that's going to come to the fore, and it's a time for us to make the case on freedom, free enterprise, and the American system.
Thank you, Governor. All right, Professor, your turn. Now, we were talking about, I have a deep concern about this whole postmodernist view and the promotion of Marxism inside of our universities. But I think sometimes we miss the bright side. Just the fact that you're teaching says to me that we are actually teaching American values. We are giving some balance inside the system. I know that you spent a lot of time on authoritarian governments. I'm really interested in kind of the conversation about how authoritarian governments actually can become more democratic. You're writing a book, I believe, on secret police inside of authoritarian rule. But I guess what I'd like to hear from you in this is, what do you think is important for us from a value standpoint to make certain that we are giving kids or people who are in college the right balance?
Well, I think that you can just encourage students to take a broad variety of classes, and to learn the different views on these perspectives. I mean, when you talk about what's going on college campuses, you might think that people like me that believe in free enterprise and property rights and democracy and economic growth are sort of a minority, but it's not really true. I'm pretty much smack bang in the middle of mainstream political science and political economy scholarship. So when students come to my class, they learn about for example, the difference between the West German system of government and the economy and the East German system of government and economy. And it was pretty clear to both West Germans and East Germans which of those systems was working better for them, right? That's why you had people risking their lives to try and cross the Berlin Wall to get into West Berlin and get into a Western liberal capitalist democracy. And so you can take a class from someone like me and learn about that and about why it was that West Germany was so much more prosperous than East Germany and why it was respecting human rights and things like like that in a way that the East German dictatorship wasn't. But then you can also take a class from someone who will take a more doctrinaire Marxist perspective. They probably won't defend the East German regime, even, to be honest. I can't even really imagine anyone trying to do that these days. But they'll tell you that certain things about Western democracy and capitalism are terrible and that it's a system of oppression. And then students can make up their own minds. And, I teach a class where I encourage students with different viewpoints to weigh in and just debate and have really contentious debates about things that they disagree with very deeply. And my experience is that they can do it, and there's no fisticuffs or, I don't have to call the campus police or anything. In fact, my major worry is that it's boring because it's hard to find topics that really divide them enough to get them hot under the collar. So I think there's more debate and more diversity of opinion on a campus like ASU than you might think, and I think that's one of the virtues of the system that we have here, and it's having this broad base of public universities with rigorous and diverse debate and people doing research all across the country in a free way. That's what's going to help us win this, as you say, this strategic competition with countries like China, because they just don't allow that. If you're sitting at a university in China and Google Scholar is blocked and Cambridge University Press is blocking access to certain books and journals for IP addresses from China, there's no way that Chinese social scientists and philosophers and scholars can be open to the sort of ideas that we can have here, and that's going to hold them back. So I do believe that what we're doing here at the public universities is important, but perhaps naively, I just think it's totally normal, and I don't really think it's that remarkable at all. It's certainly just been what I've been doing my whole professional life, and long may it continue.
Yeah, and I from my standpoint, I think I would tip my hat to ASU for making certain that balance is there. We had last week, we had a discussion about a guest that we'd had on the show, Professor Robinson, who wrote the book Why Nations Fail. And he actually said almost...
I saw that you'd had him on your show.
Yeah, he said exactly what you had said. He said, look, the best way to have this debate is by example. West Germany, East Germany, North Korea, South Korea, even the United States and China. If you take a deep look, he said there are all kinds of problems that certainly exist in a free society. He says we can't argue that problems and challenges don't exist. He says, but you have to compare it to something. And when you have a comparison, people come to the right conclusion almost all on their own. So my hat's off to you on that.
Hey, Paul, can I chime in here?
Yes.
I think you guys bring up a great point, and Henry, I really applaud the work that you're doing in academia and the way you bring these young people together and put them in a setting where through discourse and discussion, they discover the truth. I think another thing that might be a positive through all the tragedy we've witnessed in the last couple of months is some of this discussion around safe spaces on our college campuses. I mean, we're trying to prepare these young people to go into the world, to go into the workforce and to prosper. And yet now we see what's happening on many of these campuses where it's not a safe space for someone who's Jewish or someone who wants to defend Israel. And I think we'd be much better off if we could get back to some of the good old days. I remember when I was at Arizona State University, they'd have people like G. Gordon Liddy and Timothy Leary come and debate each other. And I would really tell you, I mean, it seems to me like just yesterday, even though it was a long time ago, most of the young people sitting in the MU audience hadn't formed a political philosophy yet. They hadn't really thought these things through. So I do think, of course, your parents and your family and your upbringing are invaluable. But when you can go to these institutions and there are these really wonderful discussions and debate, we used to be able to see them even on TV, and it was the only reason anyone would watch PBS to see William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal and some of those types of discussions. I think we've been robbed of discussion and debate around policy and ideas in the public square for some time because it's been shouted down. And that would be a real positive out of this, is that we were to bring this back. There's a podcast I stumbled onto called the Monk Debates. And they've had a couple great debates. They pose a question. They get people like George Will on one side and Sohrab Ahmari on the other. And they have a debate in front of a live audience. And they poll the audience beforehand and poll them after. So it's one of the many good things about these innovations of the internet and podcasts. But I'd like to see more of those in organized settings where maybe the only rule is civility and we're not going to have a fist fight. But let the best idea win and advocate and persuade for it.
Yeah, the free marketplace of ideas.
Just to add one thing is to have fun, right? I mean,
Yes.
coming to university shouldn't just be like downloading a bunch of doctrines into your brain. You should be discussing and debating and having fun. And I just taught this class the first time. This class, I call it talking across political differences. And I was really nervous teaching this class because I thought it could become contentious. But the students had a great time. They became friends. They started having pizza parties together and playing board games after class. And it was so fulfilling for me because I honestly played the minimal role and just asking the questions every week, and then they had the discussions themselves, and it was fun. It was fun, and I think that atmosphere of fun is also often lost when people think that the university is just a place to kind of download a bunch of information rather than discuss and debate.
There's actual psychological studies on one of the best things that you can do is to expose young people to ideas actually on both sides, because that tends to bring them towards the center. And God only knows, we need some people in the center, because without compromise, the country doesn't keep going. All right, gentlemen, thanks both of you. We appreciate you being on the show. Thanks for being here with the Optimistic American, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Henry.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Now help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned, and we can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.